I never imagined that the document everyone once mocked would become the reason I survived the worst betrayal of my life. When I walked out of the house for the last time, I didn't take furniture, appliances, or memories boxed in cardboard. I took only a suitcase, my documents, and the quiet certainty that none of it was ever truly mine anyway. The house looked the same as always: neatly trimmed lawn, freshly painted fence, carefully chosen tiles. But I knew every brick belonged to someone else. I had no ownership stake, no legal voice, no right to stay. And strangely, that made leaving easier. From the very beginning of our marriage, everything had been clear on paper, even if emotionally I had chosen to ignore what that meant. The prenuptial agreement was not my idea. It came from her mother, a woman who always spoke softly, but calculated every sentence like a chess move. She insisted on it before the wedding, framing it as protection for everyone involved. At the time, I believed her. I was young, in love, and naive enough to think contracts were irrelevant when two people loved each other. The agreement stated plainly that the house was premarital property and would remain solely in my wife's name. No matter how long we stayed married, no matter how much money I contributed, I would never gain ownership or decision-making power. Back then, I shrugged and signed. Love, I thought, was stronger than documents. Ironically, that same contract would later be the only thing that protected me. Despite having no legal claim, I paid half of everything: half the mortgage, half the utilities, half the renovations. I covered groceries, insurance, repairs, property taxes, expenses that quietly added up month after month. I told myself it was fair. We were a family after all, or at least that's what I believed. When her mother would occasionally remind us how lucky we were to have such a clear financial arrangement, I smiled politely and swallowed the discomfort. I didn't want to appear ungrateful. I didn't want to look suspicious. And I certainly didn't want to question my marriage. The cracks started showing slowly, the way rot spreads behind walls before anyone notices the smell. I helped her modernize the house: new kitchen cabinets, updated bathrooms, smart home systems. She insisted these improvements would increase our quality of life. I transferred money willingly, trusting that everything we built was for us. What I didn't know was that some of that money wasn't going into the house at all. It took months before the truth surfaced. At first, it was small things that didn't add up: missing funds, vague explanations, sudden defensiveness whenever I asked questions. Then came the emotional distance: late nights, phone always locked, conversations reduced to logistics. I told myself it was stress, work, routine, until one evening shattered everything. I discovered the affair by accident, the most cliché way possible. A message popped up on her tablet while she was in the shower. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't suspicious. I was just nearby when a name I didn't recognize appeared, followed by words no married person should ever read. In that moment, something inside me went cold and silent. I confronted her calmly, almost frighteningly so. There were tears, excuses, half-truths. She claimed it didn't mean anything, that it was just emotional, that she felt unseen, the usual script. What hurt most wasn't even the betrayal. It was realizing how long she had been lying while still accepting my money, my support, my effort. That night, I initiated the divorce, not out of rage, not out of revenge, but because something fundamental had broken, and I knew it would never be repaired. When I told her I would no longer help financially after the divorce, she looked genuinely shocked. as if the idea that consequences existed had never crossed her mind. She argued that I was being cruel, that I was abandoning her during a difficult time. I reminded her gently that the house was hers. The debt was hers. The choices were hers. Her family and friends reacted quickly and predictably. Calls flooded in, messages filled with concern that sounded suspiciously like pressure. They wanted me to keep helping her until things stabilized. They said divorce was already painful enough that I shouldn't make it worse by cutting financial support. Even my own mother hesitated. She told me I was punishing my wife too harshly, that people make mistakes, that compassion mattered more than contracts. I listened quietly, but inside I knew something she didn't. Compassion without boundaries is self-destruction. I wasn't trying to punish anyone, I was trying to survive. I planned to live out of my suitcase for a while. I didn't want to rush into another home, another commitment, another illusion of stability. I needed space, physical and emotional. Freedom felt terrifying, but also honest. Online, strangers understood better than people closest to me. Comments from anonymous voices validated what I felt but struggled to articulate. They reminded me that the prenuptial agreement protected both sides, that leaving didn't make me heartless, and that boundaries were not cruelty. Many advised me to limit contact with my mother for a while, not out of anger, but to preserve my clarity. I took that advice seriously. For the first time in years, I stopped explaining myself. And that's when a completely different chapter of my life began. One that forced me to question not just marriage, but relationships, expectations, and the quiet ways people take from each other without ever saying, "Thank you." After the divorce papers were filed, and the noise from family and friends finally faded into the background, I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. What followed wasn't a dramatic explosion, but a long series of moments that quietly forced me to rethink how people define love, responsibility, and maturity. A few months later, when the legal dust had settled, I tried dating again. Not seriously, not with expectations, just cautiously stepping back into the world. I met a woman named Claire through mutual acquaintances. She was intelligent, articulate, and seemed emotionally self-aware, which after my marriage felt like a miracle. Our first 2 dates were pleasant enough. Coffee, long walks, conversations that didn't revolve around trauma or bitterness. I allowed myself to feel optimistic, which in hindsight was probably my first mistake. The 3rd date never happened. Claire had mentioned early on that she had a severe peanut allergy, not the kind where antihistamines solve the problem, but the life-threatening kind. I took that seriously. I asked questions. I paid attention. When I suggested dinner for our 3rd meeting, she casually mentioned a restaurant known for its peanut-heavy menu. I hesitated and explained that I wasn't comfortable with the risk. I suggested alternatives, even offered to cook at my place using ingredients she approved. She declined all of it and accused me of being immature for overthinking something she had lived with her whole life. I canceled the date. Not dramatically. Not angrily. I simply said I wasn't comfortable continuing if basic safety was treated as an inconvenience. Her response was cold, dismissive, and tinged with mockery. According to her, I lacked flexibility and emotional depth. A close friend of mine couldn't understand my logic. She said people with allergies manage risks all the time, that I was being overly cautious, maybe even using it as an excuse to pull away. I didn't argue. I didn't feel the need to defend myself anymore. Online, once again, strangers made more sense than people in my immediate circle. Comments supported my honesty. They compared it to dating someone allergic to dogs when you owned 3. Compatibility wasn't about compromise at any cost. It was about recognizing when paths simply didn't align. Someone suggested that neutrality was key when declining people. No moral lectures, no justifications, just clarity. That advice stuck with me. Around the same time, my ex reached out again. The conversation was awkward, forced, and heavy with unresolved tension. At some point, she asked me a question I hadn't expected. "Do you still find me attractive?" I answered honestly. I said she looked her age, around 50, but that I still thought she was beautiful. I meant it. Beauty, to me, had never been about pretending time didn't exist. She didn't take it that way. She accused me of lying, of trying to soften an insult, of being emotionally manipulative. The conversation spiraled quickly. By the end, she was crying, and I was once again confused by how honesty had become an offense. Later, when I shared the exchange anonymously online, many comments suggested she might benefit from therapy. Not as an insult, but as support. It wasn't about appearance. It was about insecurity, projection, and unresolved resentment. That conversation was the last one we had that felt even remotely personal. Shortly after, financial issues resurfaced. Not mine, but hers. She called to ask for advice. She said she was overwhelmed, that credit card debt was piling up, that she didn't know what to do. I suggested something simple. Get a job. It wasn't said cruelly. It wasn't dismissive. It was practical. She had been unemployed for a long time, despite having active credit card balances and ongoing expenses. I reminded her that minimum payments didn't erase debt. They prolonged it. Her response disappointed me more than the affair ever had. She brushed it off, saying work wasn't realistic right now, that she was exploring options. I asked what options. She didn't answer. At one point, she mentioned a job listing with a salary slightly over $300 per week, laughing awkwardly as if it were beneath her. She joked that she might even earn more than me if she tried hard enough. I laughed too, but not because it was funny. When she asked if, hypothetically, she ever earned more than I did, would I then agree to split expenses 50-50? I said no. Even if she earned double, I wouldn't undo the imbalance we had lived with for years. She didn't like that answer. The conversation shifted into hypotheticals that would probably never happen. What if she became successful? What if circumstances changed? What if love meant adjusting endlessly? I realized something then. We weren't discussing reality. We were discussing fear. Fear of responsibility. Fear of independence. Fear of being alone. In our marriage, I had taken on most of the household responsibilities. Cleaning, organizing, managing bills. Cooking used to be shared, but over time it became my task alone. Eventually, we ordered takeout more often than we cooked anything at home. She still had a high credit limit, despite losing her job. Medical bills, she explained, were the reason for most of the debt. Freelance work helped a little, but nowhere near enough to cover expenses. We had been together for over 8 years and married only recently before everything collapsed. In the early years, she contributed. She cared. Somewhere along the way, that stopped. Love, I realized too late, cannot survive without mutual effort. Some online commenters were harsher than I would ever be. They accused her of using me for financial stability, of staying as long as it was convenient. Others questioned whether her intentions had ever been sincere. I didn't respond. I didn't argue. I simply read and reflected. Because deep down, I already knew the answer. By the time I thought I had emotionally closed the chapter on my marriage, another situation pulled me back into questions about boundaries, responsibility, and what people owe each other simply because they once cared. This time, it involved my son. He had recently broken up with his girlfriend, a relationship that had worried me for a long time. From the outside, she seemed polite enough, but over time I saw patterns that reminded me uncomfortably of my own past mistakes. Disrespect disguised as jokes, emotional pressure framed as vulnerability, and constant expectations without accountability. When they finally split, it wasn't explosive. It was quiet, heavy, and long overdue. She had treated him poorly for months, not violently, not dramatically, but consistently. Dismissive comments, manipulation, guilt, the kind of behavior that erodes confidence one day at a time. My son kept screenshots of their conversations, not to humiliate her, but to remind himself later why he left. Reading them made my chest tighten. No parent wants to see their child spoken to like that. Winter holidays were approaching, and she planned to return to her parents' home, which was several hours away. She reached out to my son, asking if he could drive her part of the way. Not because there were no other options, but because it was easier. He said no. That single word caused more chaos than their entire breakup. Her parents contacted him indirectly, expressing frustration and disappointment. They implied he was being petty, immature, and cruel for refusing such a small favor. Some relatives echoed the sentiment, saying that helping her didn't mean rekindling the relationship, just being decent. My son came to me, conflicted. He asked if he was being unreasonable. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked him how she had treated him when they were together. I asked whether she had respected his time, his feelings, his boundaries. He didn't hesitate before answering. No, that was all I needed to hear. I told him something I wish someone had told me years ago. You are not obligated to make your life harder to make someone else more comfortable, especially someone who repeatedly chose not to treat you well. People confuse kindness with self-sacrifice. They confuse maturity with compliance. And they often pressure others into doing favors so they don't have to feel uncomfortable themselves. I did feel sympathy for her parents. They were caught in an inconvenient situation, dealing with logistics they hadn't planned for. But sympathy does not create obligation, and it certainly doesn't erase patterns of behavior. What struck me most was how familiar the pressure felt. Once again, someone was expected to give, not because it was right, but because it was easier for everyone else if they did. My son showed me the messages she sent after he refused. They weren't aggressive. They were worse, passive, guilt-laced, carefully worded to make him doubt himself. The same tactics I had once ignored in my own marriage. I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness that he had experienced it at all. Relief that he recognized it early enough to walk away. I told him he didn't need to justify himself. Not to her, not to her parents, not to anyone. Silence, I explained, is often the healthiest response when someone tries to pull you back into a dynamic you already escaped. He listened. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like the mistakes I made hadn't been entirely wasted. If my experience helped him draw boundaries sooner than I did, then at least something good had come from it. That night, after our conversation, I sat alone and reflected on how often society pressures people to be endlessly accommodating, to forgive without change, to give without limits, to stay polite at the expense of their own well-being. My marriage ended because I finally stopped doing that. And now, watching my son choose differently, I realized how powerful that lesson truly was. After everything that happened with my marriage, the divorce, the financial aftermath, the uncomfortable conversations, and watching my son learn to protect himself, I finally understood what the prenuptial agreement really represented. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a punishment. It was a boundary drawn long before anyone knew it would be needed. For years, I believed love meant flexibility without limits, that compromise meant silence, that patience meant endurance. The contract contradicted all of that, and I resented it for a long time without realizing why. It forced clarity in a relationship where emotions blurred accountability. When the affair came to light, the contract didn't destroy her life. Her choices did. She still had her house, her freedom, her autonomy. What she lost was access to my resources, my labor, and my willingness to carry consequences that were never mine to begin with. That distinction mattered more than anything. People often asked if I regretted leaving without taking more, without fighting harder, without demanding compensation for years of contributions. The truth is, I didn't want to win. I wanted to be done. Walking away with my suitcase felt humiliating at first. Temporary living arrangements, starting over, explaining nothing. But with every day that passed, the weight I carried grew lighter. I no longer woke up bracing myself for disappointment. I no longer measured my worth by how much I provided. Distance gave me perspective. I saw how often I had been valued for stability rather than partnership. How responsibility had quietly replaced affection. How my silence had been mistaken for consent. I also saw how easily people defend systems that benefit them. Friends who once praised my generosity now criticized my boundaries. Family members who urged forgiveness never offered to share the burden themselves. That was the final lesson. Advice is cheap when it costs nothing. The comments I once read online stayed with me, not because they were kind, but because they were honest. They reminded me that protection is not cruelty, that contracts don't destroy relationships, they reveal them. That love without respect is just obligation wearing a softer name. My ex eventually stopped calling, not because she found peace, but because she realized there was nothing left to negotiate. No emotional leverage, no financial safety net, no invisible labor waiting in the background. I don't hate her, but I don't rescue people from the consequences of their own decisions anymore. As for my son, he never drove his ex-girlfriend home. She figured it out. Life went on. And in that quiet resolution, I saw something I hadn't allowed myself before. Hope. Hope that patterns can end. Hope that lessons learned late can still matter. Hope that boundaries, once drawn, can protect not just one person but generations. The prenuptial agreement didn't ruin my marriage. It saved what was left of me.